Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snugglebug Stitching, and for this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make half square triangles. Now before we get started talking too much about half square triangles, we'll talk a little bit about some of the options you have. There are half square triangles where you make 2 at a time, there are 4 at a time, and 8 at a time, and those are going to be your most common methods you can use, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. My favorite ones are the 4 at a time half square triangles because they are the only ones where you don't have to draw any lines on your squares before you start sewing. But they do have what some people consider to be a disadvantage, and that is that you have bias edges on the outsides of your half square triangle. And what that means is just that the part of the fabric that is on the outside edges of your half square triangle was actually cut on the diagonal instead of vertically or horizontally on the grain of the fabric. So that's going to make for a little bit more stretch on the edge of your 4 at a time half square triangles. Now I'm just going to be honest, this bias edges has never even once bothered me, but some people don't like it. So if it's something that you don't like, then you can always use starch or pressing spray on your fabric before you start cutting your pieces, and then you can also use the starch and pressing spray again when you go to press that seam in your half square triangle and before you square it off, and that's going to help stiffen that up a little bit and make those bias edges not so much of a factor. And one more thing before we talk about the half square triangles is the math for the half square triangles. So the math for the 4 at a time half square triangles, before we talk about that math, there's a few things terms you want to understand what they mean, and that is unfinished blocks versus finished blocks. So your finished block size is going to be the size that the block is in your finished quilt top. So for this particular quilt that we're working on my Realistic Diamonds pattern, we are using a finished size of 5 inches. So that means that once I sew this half square triangle into my quilt top, I want it to be 5 inches. So the unfinished size needs to have extra more than 5 inches to make it so that you can account for your seam allowance, which is going to be, for most quilt pieces, going to be a half inch extra. So that gives you 1/4 inch seam allowances. So this block that needs to be 5 inches in our finished quilt top, our finished block size of 5 inches, will need to be a 5.5 inch half square triangle for our unfinished size. So now that and I'll put all this stuff in the description. Now that we have that kind of cleared up, let's talk about the math. So to decide what size squares you need to use, so what size background square and what size foreground square, or if you have 2 foregrounds, what size pieces we need to use to get those 4 at a time half square triangles at an unfinished size of 5.5, we're just going to divide that unfinished block size by 0.64. So since I wanted 5.5 inch squares, half square triangles, for my unfinished block size, I will say 5.5 divided by 0.64. And for this one, that ends up being 8.59. So once you get that number, you'll then round that number up to the next 1/4 inch. So since that divided out to 8.59, I rounded that up to 8.75. And then these 2 pieces that I will use to make that half square triangle were 8.75 inches. So when you're doing this math yourself, if it's close, let's say it was 8.7 or 8.72, 8.73, I would probably go ahead and go up one more just to give a little extra wiggle room. One of the reasons I hear people say they don't like 4 at a time half square triangles is because they say they can never get them to come out to where they're big enough to be able to square them easily. So when I write my patterns, if I have one that comes out really close to the 1/4 inch increment, I'll go ahead and round up to one more just to give a little bit of more wiggle room. So let's talk about how we made these 4 time half square triangles. So we've got our 2 squares. Now these are 8.75 inch squares for this one. And we're just going to take those squares and we will stack them together, right sides together, and stack them neatly. I'm using one hand for this, so mine's not going to be neat, but we'll stack those right sides together neatly. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance around all 4 sides of that half square triangle. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see. So when I sew this, I don't worry about stopping at exactly a 1/4 inch. I just sew all the way off the edge and then do the next one. And then keep going around until I get all 4 of those sewn with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then once that's sewn together, you're going to get your ruler and your rotary cutter, and you're going to cut diagonally across both sides. Now, a tip for that, and I'm going to zoom back in here so you can see it. A tip for that is don't worry so much about lining your ruler up with the corners of your fabric. Instead, be sure that it lines up with that point where these 2 stitch lines meet. And that's going to be a lot more accurate for you. It should be close to lining up with the corners of your fabric anyway, but if it's not, worry about lining it up with the corners of those stitch lines more so than with the corners of your fabric. So I've got one here that's already cut into 4s, and you can see when I open these up, it's going to make 4 half square triangles for us. So once you have your 4 half square triangles, you're going to press that seam, and this is the point where if you are worried about the diagonal edges, the bias edges, this is the point where you can add some starch or pressing spray again when you press them. I like to press these seams towards the darker fabric, but really just press them however you want to, whatever is most comfortable for you. And press with pressing spray or starch before you square those off, because you see this part where we cut on the diagonal is what ends up being on the outside of the block. So that's why you have that little bit extra stretch on those edges. And honestly, like I said, it's never bothered me, but if it does bother you, then just use starch and that'll help a lot. So I'm just gonna pause the video and then I'll show you how to square these blocks once you have them made. Okay, so this is a squared off 5.5 inch half square triangle. So I'm going to show you how to take these half square triangles that we just made and square it off to 5.5 inches. So you get a half square triangle, and I've got a square ruler. It doesn't really matter what size square ruler. This is a 12.5 inch square ruler. You just want one that is bigger than your half square triangle. So we're going to take this diagonal line of our square ruler and line it up with a diagonal line on the half square triangle. And we are squaring these down to 5.5 inches. So we're taking our 5.5 inch line on this vertical and our 5.5 inch line on the horizontal and lining that up with the sides of the half square triangle while still keeping this diagonal line lined up with that seam. So it doesn't matter which side of the half square triangle you have on the top versus the bottom. You'll just want to pick the side that is already the most nice and square for you to line up with the edges, with the sides of your half square triangle. So I'm going to trim that. And go ahead and take care of this little dog ear right here. And so that gives you a half square triangle. Now, what if you don't have a side of your half square triangle that is already nice and squared off for you? And if you got a little wonky, you may not. So the way that you'll do that, same thing, line this diagonal line up with the seam on your half square triangle, but instead of lining the 5.5 inch lines up with the edges of the half square triangle, I've got them in a little bit. So the 5.5 inch line here and the 5.5 inch line here is actually within that half square triangle. So now that we have all that lined up, we're going to cut along the side and the top. And now here I have my 18 by 24 inch cutting mat on top of my other cutting station, and I'm going to leave this right where it is. I'm not going to move my fabric. I'm just going to flip my mat around. And now that we have got a side that we trust to be square, we're going to line the 5.5 inch line here and the 5.5 inch line here up with these sides. And when we do that, that should have us having our diagonal line lined up pretty close with that seam. So we'll cut that. And now our half square triangle is nice and squared. Now, one more thing, I know that there are rulers that you can use that are specifically for trimming half square triangles so that you will trim them before you have to press them, and that's fine. If you have one of those, use it. I made this video with a square ruler because I feel like a lot of people have square rulers. Plus, I also like the trim them this way better, and the reason I like to do that is because when you press this half square triangle before you square it, some people tend to press, not really pressing, but ironing and distorting that shape. So if you square it last, then you don't have to worry about messing up your squared half square triangle. Thank you.